Today, I'm going to recap a 2018 Korean crime action movie based on a true story called The Drug King. In the 1970s, an ordinary small-time narcotics dealer became an infamous drug lord after he had overcome many hardships. So, what are the hardships he needed to face? In the Pacific War, Japan used meth, or simply crank, in order to make their forces fearless and their workers work without sleep. After the war was over, the government put a ban on crank and the addicts had to turn to Busan to get it. Japan and Korea's expanding exports helped a self-made man in starting the golden age of crank, made in Korea. He dominated the Japanese crank market with the finest crank and was known as the Drug King, Lee Do-sam. In 1972 in Busan, Do-sam starts to work as a goldsmith for an illegal gold smuggler and is tasked to confirm the gold authenticity from the Japanese. However, the police suddenly come and the situation becomes chaotic. Do-sam is entrusted with the gold and immediately jumps into the sea. Unbeknownst to him, the police are fake and are planted by his boss in order to chase the Japanese away. After seeing his loyalty, the boss trusts him more and more. From then, the business flourishes and Do-sam becomes richer. He does the business in order to fulfill his family's needs. Later, Do-sam goes to the hospital to meet his cousin who has just been beaten by the gangsters. Suddenly, he passes by the old man who recommended him to the gold smuggler. This time, he wants Do-sam to smuggle crank to Japan. After hearing how big the reward is, Do-sam decides to go with cousin. In Japan, they deliver the crank to the Yakuza and Do-sam gets close to the boss. The Yakuza reveals that crank in Japan comes from Korea, as the laws are not as strict and the quality is better. He also tells him about a professor who is also the best cook in Korea. From the conversation, Do-sam invites the Yakuza to work together. He wants to import the raw chemicals from Taiwan, cook it in Korea, and sell it in Japan. However, the plan has to be postponed, as his gold smuggler boss is being investigated by the authorities. He uses Do-sam as a scapegoat and Do-sam has to serve some time in prison. In the prison, Do-sam meets a boat captain who knows all the hidden routes from and to Japan. Seeing the opportunity, Do-sam asks his wife to meet a corrupt officer and bribe him to free Do-sam. Some weeks later, Do-sam is freed on parole, under the pretense of having a terminal illness. Upon his release, Do-sam immediately leaves with cousin to meet captain who has been freed earlier, to establish his drug trafficking business. After some time, Do-sam finally meets captain and immediately hires him. He gives him some cash and explains the business, which entices him. Then, captain reintroduces him to the corrupt officer, who is also a member of the narcotics squad. Do-sam bribes officer to protect his business from the authorities. The officer accepts it and warns him not to use his own drug, as it may destroy him entirely. The next day, Do-sam has gathered his team and also introduces Professor as the best cook in Korea. He also invites a new smuggler from Taiwan to smuggle the raw chemicals, and his cousin due to the blood ties. Without further delay, the captain and smuggler pick the raw materials up and deliver it to Professor to be processed. With his refined techniques and complete equipment, Professor manages to complete the crank after 1 day of processing. Crystallized crank worth millions of dollars are in their hands and are ready to be sold. They deliver it under disguise, to avoid the authorities' attention. However, a problem surfaces when it's time to split the profit. Captain and smuggler secretly embezzle the money by keeping a separate ledger. Do-sam confronts them, but they argue back, as they feel they have to face a greater risk compared to the others. Unsatisfied with his teammates, Do-sam asks a Korean mafia to have a new shipping route. The mafia agrees with one condition: Do-sam has to meet the mafia boss who is in Kobe, Japan. The next day, Do-sam and cousin go to Kobe. In the lobby, he hears that the boss will be assassinated today, so he immediately rushes to the room. The boss's enemies chase after them and they get into a fight. Do-sam saves the boss from an attack and gains his favor afterwards. The boss invites him to a bar and they get into an agreement. The mafia will handle the crank shipment to Japan. This event starts the greatness of the drug king, Lee Do-sam. 2 years later, in 1974, his business has flourished and Dusam has become rich. Meanwhile, the narcotics squad is visited by a prosecutor who wants to take down the crank traffickers. To start his action, prosecutor hires a druggie as a spy to capture them. Some days later, prosecutor manages to capture a trafficker and interrogates him. He reveals that Dusam is the source and prosecutor sets his eyes on him. He also orders his men to capture the mafia as the distributor. Meanwhile, Captain knows that Dusam has been working with the mafia, so he reprimands him from doing so. He warns Dusam that they are too dangerous to deal with, but Dusam doesn't heed his words and they get into a fight. Captain wins the fight and angrily leaves the team, while also telling Dusam that prosecutor is on his tail. Hearing this, Dusam flees to Seoul to meet a new friend. He is a pharmacy company owner and is an acquaintance of mafia. With his elite relationship, Dusam is able to distribute his crank to every foreigner in Korea. After experiencing how good Dusam's crank is, friend agrees to enter an agreement. This time, Dusam cooks the crank by himself, by utilizing the knowledge he has got from Professor over the years. Professor eventually quits the job with a large sum of money from Dusam. One night, friend invites Dusam to an elite party. Dusam enjoys the ambience while watching the others get high on his crank. He looks around and finds a beautiful, elegant woman named Kim. Friend explains that Kim is the adopted daughter of chairman, the highest Yakuza leader in Tokyo, and has a lot of high net worth connections in the authorities. Hearing this, Dusam tries to win her heart as a means of expanding his business. Dusam manages to invite Kim to dinner and they start to get close. Kim knows that Dusam is a drug trafficker, so she invites him to meet his adopted father, Chairman. Dusam gives Chairman a sculpture containing his best crank and promises to fund his campaign too. Suddenly, an ex-investigator who captured Dusam for gold smuggling comes and suspects him. The investigator doesn't believe his facade as a legal food distributor. Dusam feels that investigator is a threat to his illegal business, so he meets the Yakuza to discuss the concern. Turns out, investigator has been following Dusam. Yakuza immediately pulls his tie, followed by Dusam helping him. Yakuza rams the car against the wall, which kills the investigator. To erase the trace, Yakuza mutilates the body and dumps it into the sea. Dusam can't bear the guilt and anxiety, so he drowns himself in his own drugs for the first time. 1 year later, Dusam's prosperity is boosted even further due to his cooperation with Chairman. This time, he lives in a big house in an elite neighborhood, and his name is well known throughout Korea and Japan. He makes the crank in his own underground facility, brands it Made in Korea, and distributes it under a television brand in containers. He even has his own safe with lots of cash piling up. The riches make him and Kim happy, and they get closer every day. To avoid the suspicion, Dusam takes the example of Chairman by getting involved in philanthropism. He funds lots of rural areas development and continuously pays tribute to the high-ranking authorities. Due to his actions, he receives a lot of awards and positions in important organizations. One day, he receives a message from mafia subordinate that cousin has committed murder. Cousin, who has been abandoned by Dusam for years, has been addicted to his crank and becomes delusional. Mafia comes out and confesses his disappointment as Dusam has gone behind his back and made deals with the chairman. He even threatens to kill him and cousin if he ever does that again. Then, Dusam meets his wife for the first time in a while. However, wife knows that Dusam is having an affair with Kim and gets mad at him. She also says that the riches have made him forget who he really is, and his greed will be his downfall. Some days later, cousin has fled from the rehabilitation center and is found by the prosecutor. Prosecutor utilizes cousin's anger towards Dusam to lure him out. That night, Dusam rushes to cousin's aid, only to find that prosecutor and his team are ready to capture him. Then, prosecutor brings him to the interrogation room. Prosecutor is surprised to find how well connected Dusam is. Despite the fact, prosecutor vows to imprison him by reporting it to the Attorney General. Dusam thinks that prosecutor can be bribed, and he tries to buy him with 100 million won. Hearing this, prosecutor lashes out and beats Dusam. Suddenly, his man comes in to inform that the district attorney orders to let Dusam go. Turns out, Kim has pulled her strings and has won the district attorney over. Kim has waited outside and picks Dusam up from the station. In the car, Kim plans to let cousin go to jail to save Dusam. However, the idea is unwelcomed by Dusam and they get into a fight. Dusam is ungrateful for the things that Kim has done for him and thinks that he is free due to his bribe money. He orders Kim to get out of the car and it marks the end of their affair. At night, he is called by the Yakuza who is fleeing from the authorities for killing the investigator. However, Dusam pretends to know nothing of it and abandons Yakuza. One by one, Dusam cuts off his connections who have helped him establish his drug empire, as he can't stand their threats. He even convinces one of the mafia subordinates to go against their boss and kills him. He promises to let him take control if he manages to kill Mafia. The subordinate agrees to the terms and ambushes his boss in a bathhouse. Mafia injects himself with crank and fearlessly fights his subordinates. He manages to take down some of his men before finally being stabbed and drowned to death. Meanwhile, a big riot breaks out in Korea. The people revolt to demote the newly appointed president. The situation gets more out of hand after the president is shot to death by the country's secret service. Due to the event, Dusam's connections are all wiped clean from the government. He tries to reach the surviving syndicates, but all of them are staying low to avoid the public's attention. The situation stresses Dusam and he drowns himself in his own crank further. Due to his stress and addiction, Dusam becomes an anxious and angry person. He often feels that he is going to be backstabbed and captured by his old friends and families. It turns out to be true as he receives a call from his wife, who is working with prosecutor to capture him. Over the phone, Dusam apologizes for wasting his wife and children. Prosecutor manages to locate him and immediately sets up an ambush. However, Dusam has guns and blindly shoots at them. Prosecutor requests the military's backup and a gunfight breaks out. After some struggle, prosecutor manages to enter his house and corners Dusam. Dusam tries to shoot himself to death, but prosecutor successfully saves him. In the hospital, prosecutor reveals that Kim has also been captured. Prosecutor promises to cut Dusam's life imprisonment if he wants to cooperate and spill the corrupt authorities that have helped him. He reveals his phone book containing the corrupt officers to prosecutor. In the end, all of the corrupt officers are also captured to be investigated. Dusam's drug empire's unbelievable scale is also exposed. The news reaches the headlines and the title Drug King is donned on Dusam. Dusam is only subject to 15 years of imprisonment due to his cooperation. Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like and comment to help the channel out. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.